Okay, welcome everybody to the first virtual Cambourne to Cambridge Local Liaison Forum meeting. I'm Helen Bradbury, Chair, and I'll endeavour to make the meeting run as smoothly as possible, but please bear with me. It's a digital meeting because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the health risks associated with public gatherings. This format reflects government advice and is supported by the changes to legislation made by the government to allow virtual committee meetings. This evening's forum is being hosted on the Zoom webinar platform and streamed live on YouTube. A recording of the meeting will also be made available on the GCP YouTube channel at a later date. Normal rules of behaviour apply, and everyone is reminded that any inappropriate conduct or disruptive behaviour may result in your being excluded from the meeting. We do have technical assistance on hand to support the conduct of the meeting, but do please remember that everyone is joining the meeting from their own homes, so unavoidable technical issues may arise relating to broadband connections or home IT setups, and unexpected interruptions may occur. If I could ask panelists, please, remember to mute your microphones if you're not speaking, and wait to be invited to unmute your microphones. For members of the LLF and the public who are attending via Zoom, but who are not panelists, there may be an opportunity to ask questions later. At that time, you will be invited to raise your hand via the button in the participant and chat pane. To open this pane, please click on participants and chat buttons on the bottom menu bar in your Zoom screen. Please do not raise your hand until questions have been invited, and only raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Members of the public watching the live stream on YouTube will be able to see and hear the proceedings, but will not be able to ask questions or raise their hands. I'm sure everyone will appreciate that this is a new way of conducting the LLF, and there may be some teething trouble. But with a little patience and forbearance, I'm sure this will be a productive meeting. Right, so we'll move on to the meeting now. The minutes are, as far as I'm concerned, okay. There was no fourth presentation. Moving on to the agenda, can we put that up on screen? So the format of the meeting is that there's going to be a brief introduction. Then there will be God, that's small. A GCP presentation, really revolving around the changes to the route that have been announced since the project was paused in February, and that will last about 20 minutes. Then the advanced questions that were submitted by the public will be dealt with by the project team, plus additional questions may be asked by LLF members. On that basis, it's quite important if you announce yourselves, any LLF members who are attendees and not on the panel, then we can identify you and know who you are if you ask a question. The final 50 minutes or so of the meeting will consist of panelists from the LLF making their presentations, very short presentations, and then there'll be a discussion after that. We hope that we aim that the meeting will finish at 8:30. Okay, now I would like to just introduce the panelists. So if you could maybe just raise your hand and wave when I introduce you. So Peter Blake, we have Transport Director of GCP. You there? There he is, hello. Joe Baker, now Project Manager of the Cambourne to Cambridge scheme for GCP, formerly Mott MacDonald. Laura Gates, Communications Lead, GCP. And we have James Montgomery, Environmental Lead, GCP. Hi, James. For the LLF itself, we've got Phil Allen, District Councillor Harston and Comberton, who's also the Vice Chair. Ruth Betson, District Councillor Cambourne. Shiraroba, District Councillor Cambourne. Steve Jones, who's spokesperson for the coalition of 22 parish councils west of Cambridge. Des O'Brien, Parish Councillor Bourne. Grenville Chamberlain, District Councillor Hardwick. We've got Lena Nieto, County Councillor Hardwick. Tom Bygott, District Councillor Girton and Dry Drayton. Dr. Gabriel Fox, Parish Councillor Coton. James Littlewood from Cambridge Past, Present and Future. Hi, James. Rod Cantrell, City Councillor Newnham. Dr. Marcus Gehring, City Councillor Newnham. And we have Chris Patton from the Save the Westfields campaign. Okay, good. So like I say, could LLF attendees in the audience please announce yourselves on the chat so we know that you're there. I just thought it would be a good idea to create a little bit of context for today's meeting, seeing as there has been a pause to the scheme. The LLF met last January, and following that meeting, I presented a summary to the Joint Assembly of what we agreed. However, the scheme was pulled before it reached a final decision at the Executive Board. This was due to an intervention by the Mayor, who considers the scheme not compliant with his emerging CAM network. He proposed a pause while a compliant alignment was developed. By the way, the LLF had also been raising concerns about CAM compliance since November 2018. As an interim solution, he announced direct bus services would be set up on existing infrastructure between Cambourne and key employment destinations to provide immediate benefits to commuters. However, last week we discovered that the busway was back on the table in GCP's hands. No warning about that, very short timescale and during lockdown. And I have to say, many people have said to me that given it's such a controversial scheme, that feels a little bit surprising at best. It's also in almost identical form to before. So the scheme we discussed in January. The only difference to the route is that the final alignment into the city has been changed from Adams Road to the Rifle Range, or the proposed favoured option has changed. There will be a presentation and debate on that change in a few minutes. All of our other concerns, as presented to the Joint Assembly in January, seem to remain outstanding. And to briefly paraphrase what they were, to create a context, on a strategic level, the impact of an east-west rail station at Cambourne, in January theoretical, now a reality, has not been considered, and the business case for the busway not revised as a result. That was one concern we had. Secondly, that reasonable alternative suggestions put forward by the LLF in the form of an interim inbound bus lane on Madingley Hill and a CAM, what we would consider a CAM compliance scheme by the Girton interchange, had not been properly assessed. Regarding the latter, since November 2018, the LLF has consistently expressed the view that as a future-proofed strategic alternative, a Girton interchange alignment has huge benefits over the current scheme. More CAM compliant, the route would be located on the far side of the A428, so prevents the 8 lanes of uninterrupted traffic in front of houses in Hardwick scenario. It would provide better connectivity with the Science Park and ultimately Cambridge Biomedical Campus. It would serve passengers in Eddington, and with a park and ride at the Girton interchange, could really result in significant modal shift if you could get people out of their cars there. We do consider neither of our suggestions properly assessed, and there are many outstanding questions. There was also the other concern we had, that the only remaining alternative to the proposed option is a do-nothing option that is actually invalid, because it would not even tick the local plan box. And we expressed at the time our disappointment in that. Finally, we also note in the revised papers that the revised papers do nothing to alleviate the concerns of South Cambridgeshire residents in Hardwick, Coton and Cambourne about the very significant impacts of the scheme on them. But maybe that will be suddenly solved. Anyway, let's move on to the first half of the meeting. It will take the form of a presentation by GCP
Helen,
of changes to the scheme since January.
Sorry, Helen, sorry to cut across you. Before we do that, I know we asked LLF members who are attendees, not panelists, to let us know in the chat, but I don't believe actually they have capacity to write in the chat as attendees. So in order to, and I did see that David Jones had his hand up earlier. I know that he's an LLF member. So I think in order for us to be able to do a kind of quick hand count of LLF members who are attendees, not panelists, if LLF members now could raise their hand using the raising hand function, and then we can have a quick scan through and see how many of you there are. And let's see, they're all coming up now before we move on, and then we can, if that could be the only reason anyone raises their hand for now, I'll make a note of those, and then we can continue with the presentation.
Can you see who they are?
Well, for the moment, and I can read them as I go. I've got Josh Newman, I've got Cheney Ann Payne, I've got Rita Langan, I've got David Jones, I've got Charles Doyley, I've got Ellen Kamelnitsky, who I know is asking a question later. I've got Jean Glassberg. I've got someone simply on there as John, who I'm presuming is an LLF member, but I don't know if we can work out by default who that is. We've got Daniel Strauss, Josh Matthews, Jenny Julian.
Yeah.
One which just comes up as a phone number, I'm afraid. We have someone called AJ, who we need to identify, someone called Alan only, we need to identify. Oh no, hang on a minute, sorry, those didn't.
Not an LLF member, is it?
No, those didn't have hands. I think Jenny Julian was the last hand raised.
Okay, so how many is that? Can you, you will make a note of them so we can work out.
Yes, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Their hands are going down. I've got them elsewhere though, that's fine. 6. No, a bit more than that. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 attendees in the audience.
Okay, so we're 25 in total.
Yep.
That's 20. So if we need to take a vote on anything later, that's 24 people, because of course I don't vote. 24. It should be out of 24. Okay. All right, good. That's all done. Shall we move on to? Are you making the presentation, Peter? Peter, are you making?
I'm going to start, Chair, and then Joe's going to do the body of it.
Okay. All right.
So we just go to the first slide. Thank you for the introduction. I know we'll pick up on some of your points that you raised during the question, in particular around how we've assessed the alternatives. So just in terms of some of the context that you've touched on, this supplementary liaison forum follows the last discussion we had with you in January that then went to the Joint Assembly. And we didn't take the final report to our executive board because the Combined Authority were at that point wanted to provide further information around the local plan and its compliance with the CAM metro concept. So that was published in April, and we've now had the opportunity to review the scheme against that. And we're going to talk particularly around West Cambridge to Grange Road and the parts of the route within the Cambourne area from the next slide onwards, which Joe will pick up. But just a couple of particular points that are worth mentioning, because they do come up in some of the questions that we've had. We continue to review our plans, both in terms of government and local guidance, and that will continue going forward, particularly with our work with colleagues in East West Rail, who we're very close to and having ongoing discussions with. And then obviously we had our 5-year gateway review in May. The government cleared us, so we passed with flying colours. and release further tranches of funding to take this and some of the other schemes forward, subject to the necessary governance decisions. And I think just in terms of timing, obviously we have our joint assembly later this week, but our decision board, our executive board, take place in 3 weeks' time. So there's plenty of time to socialise and discuss the information that that's already online and we'll be going through this evening. So with that, I'll pass over to Joe, who will just take you through some of the detail.
Thanks, Peter. So really the headline was to look at this issue around CAM compliance, and specifically compliance with the sub-strategy of the local transport plan, which the Combined Authority has issued in draft on behalf of the Mayor. And the purpose of that sub-strategy is to define really what's needed for a CAM compliant scheme. Overall, having reviewed the C2C scheme against that draft sub-strategy, which is out for consultation at the moment, the scheme is compliant with what it states. We identified 2 areas, and there is a supporting note that goes through it, which we felt either required or would benefit from particular consideration. And I'll go through both of those now. The first is the approach from Cambourne, and that specifically relates to the issues around East-West Rail, which we discussed at the previous LLF. And the second one is the route from West Cambridge to Grange Road, which again, we've discussed fairly extensively recently. So I go forward, Beth. In terms of the Cambourne area, the sub-strategy emphasised the need for integration with East-West Rail. I think that's recognised. That was an issue that arose at the previous LLF and was starting to be discussed at the Joint Assembly as well. What I think it's important to note is East-West Rail is likely to result in construction of a new station in the vicinity of Cambourne, but at the time we're speaking, they have announced a preferred corridor which indicates a route to the south of Cambourne and a station somewhere in that vicinity. There isn't yet a preferred route, and there is no certainty as to, for example, the location of the station. What we have a reasonable level of certainty is that their current aspiration is to provide a station in the Cambourne vicinity. So that does limit how much detail we can go into at this stage in the process. Once there is a confirmed location, and we're not anticipating that probably until next year, we believe there may be further consultation on alternative locations to come first. Then there would be additional local works needed to look at how C2C can maximise integration both with East-West Rail, but also the aspiration of the Combined Authority to eventually extend the CAM system out as far as St Neots. And there are no clear plans for either of those at this point in time. So the C2C proposal, as we have at the moment, follows the route that we've been following for some time, which goes on existing highways into the centre of Cambourne. That is the sort of default situation without clarity on what East-West Rail or CAM may do in the future. As and when there is further detail, then either C2C may need to be amended, or as part of the next stage of CAM, there may be further development of the scheme to provide, for example, a travel hub at the proposed East-West Rail station, and maybe further extension of the route, which ideally would go around Cambourne West, for example. So the C2C business case, as it stands, the outline business case is developed in line with DfT guidance and reflects committed schemes. Once there is a preferred route for East-West Rail, and there is none at the moment, the next round of the business case will reflect that. That may or may not happen before a TWA application. It really depends on timing of progress of East-West Rail. But at such point where there is enough certainty that we should amend the business case, we will take that on board. Certainly, I would anticipate the full business case for the scheme, which is the sort of final round of business case before any funding is committed to construct the scheme. One would imagine that East-West Rail will have fairly high level of clarity. And in line with the requirements of DfT guidance, at that stage, we would take East-West Rail on board. But we really can't do it until we've actually got something that we can assess. There isn't any clarity on station location, but also issues such as, for example, the frequencies of services, destinations served. So actually what will be provided by East West Rail at that location. So the next slide, please. So on the Cambourne area, just as a reminder, the first section of the scheme runs through Cambourne itself. We've looked at options to go through Cambourne West, and those would provide one set of options for access to that area. It may well be that as the CAM proposals for Link St Neots develop, that alternatives are looked for. It may well be that, for example, the combination of the CAM and East West Rail developments look at an alternative alignment towards an EWR station. But at this point in time, what we're looking at is a scheme that really reflects the default situation. It obviously, in this particular instance, it's using an on-road alignment, so we're not looking at investing in things that might not be needed in the future, and that's our base situation at the moment in the Cambourne area. So we can move on, please. So the second area is compliance with the sub-strategy in terms of West Cambridge to Grange Road. There are two policies that we looked at. The first is policy 15 calls for a segregated route as a default. Clearly, in some cases, there may be issues where it really is very difficult to segregate. For example, where you're having to cross major roads where clearly you can't fully segregate. In this instance, we obviously have for some time looked at the alternatives between the Rifle Range, which is segregated, Adams Road, which isn't. We've discussed, particularly at the last LLF, the Adams Road and the Rifle Range issues quite extensively. But in terms of looking at segregation as a default, in this section, clearly the Adams Road alternative wouldn't fit alongside that. And you'll recall when we talked about this at the LLF and the Joint Assembly earlier in the year, we commented on the fact there was a very fine balance between the two. There's also policy S10, which calls the scheme to support and complement walking and cycling. Again, overall, C2C is compliant, and in fact, it is compliant with E15 as well, because segregation is a default for the scheme. However, again, local groups, notably CamCycle, have voiced sustained concerns about cycling provision along Adams Road. That point's been made effectively. And again, given the fact that there is a finely balanced alternative, we sort of revisited the scoring based on further information that had come forward, and given the fine balance between the two, came to the conclusion that in order to try and reflect what was coming out of the LTP sub-strategy, Rifle Range now would sort of nose back into place as the preferred alignment. Probably important to say that doesn't mean that there is a fundamental change in either. Both options would be potentially possible. Technically, both would be compliant, but the move towards Rifle Range gives a higher level of compliance with the sub-strategy. So the next slide, please. This, I think, will be familiar to most people, the alignment round the corner of the Westfield and then along to the Rifle Range. And just to confirm that the CAM sub-strategy of the LTP just sort of shifts that balance towards the use of Rifle Range in order to enable segregation and to complement the promotion of walking and cycling. Next slide, please. So this, just as a reminder, the final route proposal, which will be familiar to most people, is not wildly different to what we've had before. Again, this is the version that we will be taking forward to develop the environmental impact assessment. So it's not a final scheme, but this is the route that we would be proposing to recommend to the Executive Board on the 25th of June as potentially the preferred route for the scheme. Have the next slide, please. And just to give you a quick update on the process of scheme development, subject to approval by the Executive Board on that date. The next major task, which picks up quite a few of the concerns which people have raised in some of the questions for this evening, is the full environmental impact assessment. There's been quite a lot of environmental appraisal done to date, but that's been part of the work for the business case. This is a formal environmental impact assessment. In order to do that, the first task is to agree the scope of that assessment with the DFT. So there needs to be clear agreement on precisely what is to be appraised, and the various statutory bodies have a chance to influence that. There will be a need to gather together a range of data. There is some data collection ongoing. There's been quite a lot done over the last couple of years. COVID-19 has perhaps not helped that situation, but as the regulations relax, we will be getting back out on site to complete some of the surveys around different forms of wildlife. Importantly, there's a stage of refinement of the design and mitigation. So starting to develop mitigation measures and looking at where we can tweak the design further, drawing both on the work and consultation done to date, further discussions with stakeholders such as CPPF and the National Trust to try and come up with an optimised alignment. That would then be subject to a further round of public consultation, which we hope would take place this autumn and would give the community a further chance to comment on a much more detailed version of the scheme. So clear scheme drawings, details about mitigation measures, issues around, for example, tree felling, replacement of trees. There will be very clear information on that to a level of detail that hasn't been available in the past because it simply hasn't existed. And that would then lead towards the submission of a Transport and Works Act order, which is effectively the planning application for the scheme. That currently is aimed for spring 2021. And the timing thereafter really depends on the process that it goes through with both the Department for Transport and the Planning Inspectorate, as we know, likely to involve a public inquiry, and the timescale for that is somewhat unpredictable, but the aim would be still to be trying to get the scheme open in late 2024. So I think that's all. Beth, thanks very much for your attention. Clearly we've got a range of questions to ask, so I'll hand back to the chair. You're on mute, Helen.
Okay, thank you. We'll crack straight on with the questions because we're quite behind time because we were late starting. Can I start, please, with I've tried to group the questions, and because a lot of the questions came in several different parts on different subjects, I've tried to sort of bring together themes. So you may not get all of your questions asked, but there will be answers to all of the questions in all of the parts on the GCP website after the meeting. But like I say, I've tried to group them so we're not duplicating. I'm going to start with the rifle range set of questions, and could we invite Rita Langan, please, Cranmer Road Residents Association.
Unmute. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello, thank you. Would the GCP officers please confirm whether or not the board will be basing its decision on the information in the June 2020 board papers and appendices to make its decision on the route alignment? We would like to know whether the board will be using additional information that has not been made public to come to its final decision. Thank you.
So all information from GCP offices is contained in the submitted board papers that you note. So all that information is in the public arena.
Thank you.
Can we invite Ellen Kamanetsky, please, from the Goffway Residents Association? Could you please just ask the part of your question that refers to the rifle range, please, Ellen? She's not appeared, has she? I'll answer. I will ask that question then. So this is on behalf of Goffway Residents Association. So the rifle range route and a bridge over the Bin Brook will certainly increase the flood risk for our community. What are you going to do about that?
So the design of the rifle range option will be undertaken in discussion with and subject to the approval of the Environment Agency. The intention of that would be to ensure that as a minimum, flood risk is not increased. It may be that through the design process, actually, we managed to reduce flood risk, but that the Environment Agency would be reviewing any designs.
Okay, thank you. Caroline Humphrey, are you there?
I'm allowing Caroline to talk.
Mute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question was about why the route couldn't go the busway to West Cambridge site, where it would link up with a lot of places that people actually work and want to go to, and then have further onward routes to a range of different places in Cambridge, as opposed to ending up in Grange Road, which is likely to become very congested, and people anyway don't particularly want to go there.
So if we terminated the busway in West Cambridge, that would really leave the scheme incomplete, with for some years the buses needing then to just go and access onto Madingley Road and run into the town through the existing traffic that way. Whilst the CPCA is hoping to complete CAM over the next decade, there isn't currently any certainty on timescale of delivery. And the purpose of C2C really is to enable shorter term developments such as Bourne Airfield and West Cambridge to develop and to deliver local congestion benefits. Clearly, once CAM is completed, then that does give us an option, and either option would then provide additional connectivity for cyclists and pedestrians to the rapidly growing West Cambridge campus. So we would still provide a useful route. And I think we have picked up the issue around Grange Road or West Road before, but there has never been an intention that buses would terminate either of those locations. I think that has been made very clearly to previous meetings.
Okay. At the end of each section, I'll allow LLF members to ask something. But is Emma Fletcher there, please? You have a question.
Unmuted, hopefully.
Yeah. How can access be guaranteed at all times to the rugby club to gain access to our training ground along the rifle range track? Whilst daily use is required and could possibly be accommodated, we have really large concerns over the access needed by large, wide, slow-moving vehicles carrying marquees and delivering temporary toilet blocks in the 2 weeks in November around the Steel Bodgers match, our biggest single fundraising activity of the year.
So we had discussions with yourselves around particularly the Steel Bodgers match, but also access issues. And, to be fair, when we started looking more seriously at Adams Road, concerns around those issues were one of the factors that we took very seriously at that point in time. In terms of guaranteeing access at all times, we are working on the basis that this is likely to be a technology guided scheme, so it'll be a conventional road rather than a curb guided bus. If that's the case, it's a much easier scheme to route conventional vehicles along, whereas it would have been more difficult to do that with a curb guided bus. If it was curb guided bus, then there would need to be a service road, and that would be an alternative but less convenient road for access. But we are aware of the need to provide access to the training ground in particular. In terms of the Steel Bodgers, I think we recognise that the build and breakdown of that event is going to be a challenge, and we would need to agree a sort of particular operational regime for that period in time. And we would certainly be intending to keep sort of talking with the rugby club and the other landowners such as Clare Hall as well in the area as the proposals develop.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I think as we're going to talk about that later with Chris Pratton, I think maybe it's not appropriate that we ask some questions at this stage unless anybody particularly objects to that. No. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to more about the macro view, so these the larger strategic issues. And so could Philip Allen, District Councillor for Comberton and Harston, please ask first your COVID question.
Thank you. What detailed analysis has there been on the impact of COVID-19 on the likely future demand for public transport and changes to levels of road traffic under the new normal, including levels of switching to working from home and flexible hours impacting on peak travel time?
So can I ask a subsequent question, a supplementary question from Alistair Burford on this? So can you tell me on what evidence you have based your assumption that the impact on public transport will be short term? especially as you have commissioned Hatch Regeneris to explore the impact and their findings, and this will not be available until later this month?
So the impact of COVID-19 on long-term travel demand is the subject of intense speculation amongst particularly the academic community. Let's be honest, none of us know what the outcome is likely to be, so there is no detailed analysis. It's not clear what the new normal, as it's been termed, is going to look like. As things stand, GCP has been tasked through the City deal with providing infrastructure to enable growth. And at that point in time, Peter referred to the fact that the Gateway Review had been recently passed, which I think demonstrates that government is still supportive of the overall aims. So at this point in time, that remains the brief which GCP is working to. One of the next stages downstream after a public inquiry would be the need for a full business case. And that's the sort of final stage in the Green Book Treasury process for a scheme development. That would be needed before investment is committed. And clearly at that point in time, that business case would be based on much better understanding of the impacts of COVID. It would look at changes potentially in future demand if we, by that stage, as one imagines, have greater clarity on where we're likely to be. I think we all have to remember that 3 months ago, this still seemed like quite a hypothetical thing. It feels like it's gone on forever for all of us. One would like to think in 6 or 12 months' time we'll have greater clarity, but at the moment, there is no detailed analysis because nobody really knows what the new normal is going to be.
Okay, now we're going to go on to East West Rail. Phil, if you could ask your question. This has also been raised by Roger Tomlinson, Ellen Komanitsky, and Roger Tomlinson. Okay.
Okay, what detailed analysis, not just high-level assumptions, has been undertaken since these papers on C2C were last presented in February on the subsequent announcement of the East-West Rail route going via Cambourne and its impact on the business case for C2C? I know that Joe mentioned it briefly in his presentation earlier, but I do point out that the decision made by the board later this month is unleashing the possibly unstoppable avalanche of this. So what detailed analysis has taken place before that decision is taken at the end of this month?
Just to pick up your supplementary point, I think that the phrase unstoppable avalanche is a little misleading. So as you'll be aware, the next stage is to prepare the environmental impact assessment. That would inform the Transport Works Act order. That would go to public inquiry, which would be subject to intense scrutiny. And by that stage, we may well have greater clarity as to what East West Rail are promoting. At this point in time, as I alluded to earlier, we have not done a detailed analysis of East West Rail because we don't have clarity of what the preferred route is. We've got clarity as to a preferred corridor in that it would be south of Cambourne with a station somewhere in the vicinity south of Cambourne. But the sort of transport modelling and economic appraisal that we would need to do does need to have greater certainty as to actually what it is we're modelling, what sort of services those are likely to involve. As Peter said earlier, we'll continue to work closely with East West Rail as they develop their routes and station proposals and as they undertake modelling of those, so we can ensure maximum integration between the schemes as they move forward.
Okay, I now want to move on to Hardwick. So I want to ask Pauline Jocelyn, Deputy Chair of Hardwick Parish Council, please to ask her question. Shall I read it?
No, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That's good. As Helen said, it's Pauline Jocelyn here. In October 2019, Hardwick started a poll. The poll was called Save Our Trees on St Neots Road, and the result for saving were 547 electronic signatures for saving, 319 paper-based signatures for saving, which makes a total of 866 signatures. A village meeting was arranged concerning Save Our Trees. In excess of 80 people attended the meeting, and a show of hands indicated their united support for Save Our Trees. I challenged the GCP to agree that from this evidence, that Hardwick does not support the destruction of our St Neots Road greenery to accommodate a busway, which will primarily be to serve new villages and towns west of Cambridge, west of Hardwick, sorry. Is the GCP listening to Hardwick residents, or are we being totally ignored?
So, as you'll be aware, GCP has and will continue to engage with Hardwick Parish Council and other representative groups on the corridor. Sadly, not all those groups, including yourselves, will necessarily always agree with what we do, but public consultation engagement's been a key element of the work to date. We have gone out and talked to communities with widely differing views, and locations such as Hardwick and Coton have been visited regularly. In terms of your specific concerns, we've been to parish council meetings, we've hosted drop-in events in Hardwick to hear from and respond to local residents and businesses. We will continue to do that. So we will listen to Hardwick residents as we proceed. And as I said, for the EIA stage, there will be further engagement with stakeholders in the public, where the emerging design and proposals for mitigation will be also presented for further discussion and comment. So we are certainly listening. We unfortunately can't necessarily listen and go along with what everybody asks throughout the area.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask Ruth or Nick Eng to announce themselves to ask their question on noise pollution? Anybody? No? Shall I ask that then? Okay, so noise pollution. The noise of the A428 is already substantial, particularly in summer when windows are open. The road noise is substantial and keeps residents in Hardwick awake at night. The removal of trees will substantially increase the noise pollution and will make the noise levels intolerable. Has the acceptability of increased noise levels been considered, and do the needs of local residents who are affected by the increase in noise matter in this regard? Has any research been carried out by the Combine Authority to determine whether the noise levels will be within acceptable legal standards?
So I think there are a couple of different sides to that question. I think we recognise, and we've made this clear in previous discussions, that there is a significant noise impact of the A428, and that has a negative impact on St Neots Road residents. Trees themselves have a fairly limited impact on traffic noise, and that's one of the reasons why there is a substantial problem with traffic noise in the area. Unless you have a solid barrier, you do basically get the same or more or less the same impact of noise. What we've talked about previously and are still committed to is the provision of noise barriers, which could provide more effective protection. And we would propose to look at either improving the noise barrier in places where it's there but not effective, maybe in installing more, not, I hasten to add, to deal with noise from the busway, which with use of electric vehicles would be very minimal, but to help make sure that overall there's a net reduction in traffic noise rather than an increase. I mean, it's important to say we recognise that there will be, for example, visual impacts of the loss of trees, but on traffic noise specifically, the impact will be minimal.
Okay, can I ask Rebecca Burrell, please? Has a question on the existing road. Are you there, Rebecca?
Yeah.
You should be unmuting.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my question is, why is a dedicated busway needed for the part of the route along St Neots Road in Hardwick? And why can buses not use the existing road?
So as we've talked about, the intention of the scheme is to provide a dedicated route, which will be segregated. That's part of the issue about creating something that can use in the future. The existing road, as you say, I wouldn't say minimal traffic, but it's not necessarily that heavily used. But you are subject to interaction with a range of other vehicles, with vehicles coming in and out of houses, things like that. And the intention would be to provide a dedicated route where the buses would be undisturbed. And that sort of dedicated route is why things like the existing guided busway in terms of passenger patronage has been very successful. This work is addressed in the OBC, which goes through the sort of modelling that you've asked for in the detail of your question. And that work will be developed further in the environmental impact assessment, which will look at some of the negative impacts in greater detail as well. So the sort of modelling around costs and environmental impacts is covered already in the OBC.
Thank you. Could I ask Bob and Pat Porlock, please, to ask the part of their question on the danger to cyclists, so the front door of the properties. Are they there?
Hello?
Yeah. So
You got me?
Yes. So the bit of your question on,
Yep.
on danger to cyclists, please.
Well, the fact is there's about 80 drives that will be going on to the proposed route, and they're proposing to put a cycleway adjacent to the hedge line. And when you pull out it with a car, they're very steep, most of our drives, and the car will protrude. And even now, although it is not a cycleway in front of our house, we've had some very close calls with people cycling along. How can this possibly work? Surely you've got to have a different solution.
So the principle of having a cycleway past houses is fairly typical. That, as you know, pavements and cycleways often do. The proposed alignment has a significantly wider non-motorized motorist route. So the cycles will have more space to perhaps move away from drives, particularly as they see a car beginning to emerge. And in terms of the specific designs, the layout of every aspect of the scheme will be reviewed at the road safety audit stage. And there are a number of road safety audits that need to be undertaken as the scheme develops. But I think the key thing is that with a much wider route, it should be easier for cyclists to take defensive action, particularly where they can see cars beginning to protrude from drives. As you say, the existing situation is perhaps not ideal anyway.
There's a supplementary question on that from Rebecca Burrell as part of her question, and she's asking that it's hard to see how the proposals as they stand can be implemented without a reduction in space for cyclists along this stretch. Could you provide more detail on what is being done to enable cycling along the route?
Well, I think what we've always said and would stick with is the principle of we providing a 3-metre non-motorised user route. So I'm not quite sure exactly what she's concerned by, but that's been a fairly clear commitment, and that does form part of the alignment. Indeed, the slightly misleading statements about the 9 lanes of interrupted traffic, actually, I think the 9th of those is the proposed cycling route, probably.
Okay, there are lots and lots of questions from Hardwick, but I can't. We're going to have to. I might come back to some if we've got time, but we're going to have to move on, I'm afraid. So Grenville, you're going to have to deal with that later. Can we move on to Cambourne? Could David Jones, Cambourne Town Council, please make himself known?
Am I allowing him to talk?
Yep.
Yep.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. I think our questions have been covered to an extent. They revolved around there currently isn't a bus stop shown in Upper Cambourne, the lack of any information on a travel hub in Cambourne, and an update on the potential location of a station and conversations with East West Rail regarding that. You've provided some information on that. Cambourne Town Council are very supportive of both Cambourne to Cambridge and East West Rail, but are very much against a station to the southwest of Cambourne, where it basically just won't be accessible to people from the A428, won't align with Cambourne to Cambridge busway, and we consider have quite a large impact in terms of amenity with people travelling through Cambourne to get to a potential station. So, I mean, from what you said tonight, you have provided an update on discussions, but it sounds like you are kind of taking your cue from East West Rail in terms of where the station is. I think you've done the most work of anyone in terms of this public transport corridor, and I think we'd like to see the GCP take more of an active role in trying to steer the location of the station to where it is most accessible. And just would appreciate your comments on whether that's something you can push for.
So just taking the different bits of the question, I think the first one, which is Upper Cambourne, that's a fair comment to be made, and that's something we can certainly pick up with yourselves. In terms of travel hub, we did start a dialogue with the town council about a travel hub, and there is a clear commitment to that. However, I think our view is that once there's clarity as to where an east-west rail station is, that will probably impact quite what a travel hub possibly in the centre might comprise. So we would see a very strong need for further discussions with yourselves and East-West Rail once there's a bit more clarity coming out of East-West Rail. In terms of station location, I mean, we engage regularly with East-West Rail, will continue to do so, but really the issue of alignment and location of station is something that largely we're waiting to hear from them. It's not something that GCP has any sort of jurisdiction over. So we're waiting to find out more. I'm sure you'll be making your views clear, and my understanding is that there will be further consultation on station locations, but you will be aware of the preferred corridor as it's been announced at the moment, obviously.
Okay, just a final question. Ed Durrant, are you there from the Pegasus Group?
You should be able to unmute now.
Yes, I'm. Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Presently, Cambourne High Street is a single-lane carriageway, and the only viable way to widen it is through the development of the last remaining land parcels on the north and south of the High Street, which will also deliver new homes and shops for Cambourne. The site is owned by my client, Newcrest, who has a history of successfully delivering retail units in Cambourne. Notwithstanding this, we've been struggling to engage positively with officers and members of the District Council on the proposals for the High Street, and my client is now having to assess whether the project will come forward. What assumption is the GCP making about the development of the High Street coming forward and delivering a widened carriageway that will be essential to enable the proposed travel times between Cambourne and Cambridge to be met?
So at this point in time, we don't have any specific assumptions with regards to High Street. I think our view is once the vehicles get to that point, they are largely in Cambourne. They will not be running at high speed through the built-up area of Cambourne. So we wouldn't be wishing to promote high-speed running in what will clearly be an inappropriate location. As per the previous question, there's clearly a need for further engagement with the Town Council, East-West Rail, and also the Combined Authority, looking at things like travel hub locations and further planning of routes in and around Cambourne. So I think there is certainly scope for more discussion, but there's no sort of presumptions from our part in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just before we move on, I see that Roger Tomlinson has had his hand raised for about half an hour. So can we let Roger speak?
Yeah, you should be able to unmute now.
I was concerned about...
Can you turn yourself up?
Sorry?
Can you speak up?
Yes, I was concerned about Joe Baker's answer in relation to the evaluation of East-West Rail, because he talked about the situation in Cambourne. What he didn't do was make any mention of the possible impact of East-West Rail on commuting from Cambourne and access to Cambridge South Centre and North stations, which, as I understand it, would substantially reduce the potential demand for the busway route.
Thank you, Roger.
So I sort of touched on that question already. And I think also the question from the Town Council picks this point up as well, is simply we don't know where the Cambourne station is likely to be. It seems from the publicity material we've seen so far, it's certainly not going to be a central Cambourne station. The proposal appears to be for a station out towards the south of Cambourne. That doesn't mean necessarily that a large proportion of Cambourne residents would necessarily be using East-West Rail, depending on where they're going. One would imagine some going to CBC, it would be convenient. For others going to destinations like West Cambridge, which is not served by East-West Rail, it's unlikely there'll be a major change. So that in terms of doing any sort of detailed analysis of the type, which quite reasonably people have been asked us to do, we do need some clarity as to actually where that station is. We can't make an assumption that everybody from Cambourne will use a station where we don't know its location. So this is not a closed issue. We're not assuming that there isn't something that needs to be looked at, but at the moment we don't have any further information on it. or the clear commitment to what the route will be yet.
Thank you, Joe. I think we're going to move on from the questions now, and we're going to move to the second part of the meeting, which is the LLF panel talking and making some short presentations. Is everybody happy with that? Raise your hand if you're not. There's a lot of people to look at. Okay, can I start with number one? I've tried to group your presentations so that they are on a theme, and the first set of 4 are specifically on comments on the route and the scheme per se. So can we start with Gabriel, Dr. Gabriel Fox, please, on behalf of the Local Liaison Forum Technical Group, who have worked with officers for the last 2 to 3 years to iron out some problems.
Yes, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we have had multiple meetings as a technical subgroup with the GCP officers and consultants. Unfortunately, we have really made minimal progress on underlying assumptions, on metrics and on performance issues with the proposed route. We remain of the opinion that there are serious flaws in the process and the way the project has run. Many of the decisions have been driven by a fundamental assumption, which I think Joe reiterated, that the scheme must be off-road, but that actually turns out not to be the case. And then there have been other fundamental assumptions which have been driven by inaccurate or misrepresented information, such as road space availability on Madingley Hill and on the overbridge over the M11. It's also been a serious issue that the route has been developed in 2 unconnected segments, which has led to various inconsistencies and issues. And the full end-to-end scheme has not been consulted on. We understand that's now going to happen from what Mr. Baker said, but it has not been compared to a reasonable low-cost alternative. And so we see at least 3 major critical issues remaining with the latest preferred scheme. Firstly, it's a very poor performing scheme. Looked at it on an end-to-end basis. So, for example, Cambourne to the biomedical campus or to the city centre is actually substantially non-segregated. The journey times are no better than cheaper alternatives or private cars, and the value for money is very poor. Secondly, the business case comparator has been identified as a do minimum, which is essentially the existing City 4 bus service with no bus priority, and that is grossly inadequate and really not fit for purpose in terms of proper decision making at the next stage. And as we've heard repeatedly, the huge impact of the major east-west rail infrastructure has so far been completely unfactored. And although Mr. Baker's made the point that it's difficult to make detailed business case assumptions, the wording that's included in the report, the current stage report, is really grossly misleading, we would say. If you go to my second slide. Thank you. So just looking at these in a little bit more detail. Firstly, the currently proposed scheme has a very poor performance profile considering the very high cost. If you look at the Cambourne to biomedical campus route, for example, that's only 50% off-road. According to GCP...
Are we still on slide 1 here? No.
Next slide, sorry, we need to go, yes, thank you. Thank you. According to the GCP, it'll take 30 minutes. It requires 3 90-degree turns to get from the south part of the West Cambridge site onto the M11 so that you can get to Addenbrooke's, and that more than uses up any possible time saving that might have been generated by going off-road through Hardwick and Coton. Likewise, to the city centre, it's an inefficient route. It requires navigating busy Grange road rush hour traffic to get either northwards back to Madingley Road for the optimal northern access to the city centre where the roads are segregated, or the less efficient south route via Silver Street and the congested streets by that route. Secondly, the benefit cost ratio is really very poor for a publicly funded scheme. It's somewhere between 0.2 and 0.4. It's about 1/10 of what would be considered acceptable value for money. to get something closer to acceptable, it's been necessary to propose hundreds of millions of pounds of rather speculative long-term benefits, and we don't really think they can reasonably be generated by a 10-kilometre or so bus route with a capacity of less than 1,000 extra peak period commuters a day compared to the existing bus service. And thirdly, taking into account getting to and from bus stops and waiting for the bus itself, the scheme really offers no journey time benefit over private car transport, and so is really unlikely to drive sufficient modal shift to justify the kind of expense. There are alternatives. I think others are going to discuss them in a moment. The technical subgroup has repeatedly asked GCP to work up a simple hybrid scheme, which includes bus lanes, bus priority measures on Madingley Hill, which would be quick to implement, cost effective, and a lot more popular with local residents. But this has been consistently rejected by GCP, largely on spurious grounds. The fact is that it could actually be implemented far more easily and with far less land take than the proposed route through the Green Belt. And our projections indicate that the route performance would be just as good as the GCP's proposed scheme, but it seems that decision makers unfortunately will not get to consider it, which is disappointing. And last and not least, East West Rail is coming. We've heard a fair amount about that. That is going to offer journey times of about 15 minutes from Cambourne to Addenbrooke's, perhaps a few minutes more to the city centre. It is clearly absurd to suggest that such a major piece of infrastructure will not impact the business case. And indeed, surely many commuters will prefer the train for various reasons: journey time, reliability, ride quality, and so on. Leaving the bus really to have possibly some residual use for some intermediate stops, possibly just the West Cambridge side, but at what kind of benefit cost ratio? And so to call it complementary really is a bit absurd and it's rather insulting to our community intelligence, I think. And apportioning putative long-term land value uplifts and employment gains entirely to the bus when a £2 or £3 billion heavy rail route will also serve the corridor is misleading, and at the very least that needs to be reflected in the papers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel. Could we now take James Littlewood, please?
Yes, I wanted to just remind people about some of the environmental concerns. And in particular, just if this busway proceeds, then the sensitive landscape to the west of Cambridge will be built over by a new railway, a new busway, and also the tarmacking of the Whitwell Way for the Comerton Greenway. So the cumulative impact on landscape and communities will be significant. These three schemes all compete with each other in some way or another, and there seems to be little understanding at the present time of the cumulative impact of these schemes, or much willingness to coordinate and potentially to adapt these schemes to prevent overdevelopment. The proposed route of the busway would go through wildlife meadows, mature woodland and scrubland, all of which have abundant wildlife and some of which are locally designated. And I showed these via a slideshow at the last local liaison forum, and they're available on the Cambridge Past, Present and Future website. And finally, just say Historic England has commented that any scheme in this sensitive corridor will be damaging. So given that East West Rail decision creates the possibility of new alternatives, by looking at the three schemes together, it ought to be possible to provide for future transport needs with much less damage to the landscape and local communities. And I think we're calling on the GCP to pause and explore these properly. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Can I now ask Chris Pratton of the Save the West Fields campaign to talk about the rifle range?
Can everyone hear me? I'm just resetting my screen. Yeah, so I'd start off with, I'd like to talk a little bit about buses. Gabriel's touched on this a little bit. So for years now, we've been trying to understand where the buses are going to go after Grange Road and where the particular advantages are of the scheme and so on. And details are still really inadequate on that front. But there is now at least a bus strategy document, but that bizarrely seems to show that there's actually only one route that will use this route across the West Fields into the West Cambridge side, and that's the one that goes to Drummond Street. The document even shows that one of the other routes from Eddington to the biomedical campus won't even bother to use the new route over the West Fields. It'll go up the Grange Road and onto Maddenley Road like it does, I guess, at the moment. So it seems strange that we can justify this huge amount of damage to the West Fields just for one bus route. But looking further, in terms of timings, there seems to be only one point in any of these documents where any detail is given to the board as to the advantages in terms of bus timings. And that this is one table about the Drummonsby option. But looking at it more closely, it appears to only deal with the inbound bus route. Because even for the peak period, this is only giving timings for an inbound journey from Cambourne to Drummond Street. Does this mean that people from Cambourne only come into the city centre and don't travel back home at the peak hours? Now, the suspicious amongst us might think this is because the outbound route has some specific problems, because the inbound route can go down Downing Street as one way. The outbound route has to come around via Lensfield Road, which obviously is a dreadful place to bring a bus during the rush hour. So for this hugely damaging piece of infrastructure, the board are only being presented with a subset of buses incoming into Cambridge. It just doesn't seem that it justifies the huge amount of damage to the West Fields. So moving on a little bit, what about the infrastructure? So if you could move on to the next slide. So again, details of the precise form of the bridge over Bin Brook have been scant up to now. The GCP have been very keen to play down the size of this bridge. In fact, they've even been playing it down when they talk to their consultants. For example, their planning consultants have been told the C2C will not result in significant development above the ground level. Their Greenbelt consultants have been told to consider a route that has limited visibility. Even at this late stage, the officers have been very shy of providing any details of this bridge. In fact, in the board documents, they haven't even bothered to update the final route to not show Adams Road. It's still showing Adams Road. There's still no details of this bridge on there. The only details we can find is in one of the Oxford assessment appendices that gives us this diagram of what the bridge will actually look like over the Bin Brook and then down the rifle range. And it's an extraordinary structure. I think it'd be more accurate to term it a flyover than a bridge. Just to give some idea of scale, the embankment for this bridge as it runs up to the bridge is about 100 meters long on either side. So you can imagine how large a flyover will need to be if it requires a 100-meter run up on each side. Again, they've been a little bit shy about what the details of the exact height of this bridge are. But if you sort of infer from the scales and the fact that some of these earthworks have to be a 1 in 2 gradient, it appears that this bridge could be as much as 2 meters higher than the current level of the bridge. How this can be described as limited visibility, I don't know. It's an extraordinary structure. The length of the embankment running up to this bridge is as long as the run up to the bridge over the M11. It's the same length. It's massive. So even based on the scaled down description that the GCP gave to their consultants, the report still suggests that very special circumstances will need to be shown for the rifle range route. Their reports only explicitly say that very special circumstances won't be needed for the Adams Road route. So how can the GCP justify making this route change, given the high level of legal risk of this route in planning terms? It's not mentioned anywhere in any of their scoring.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chris. As this is a new development, do we actually, as a group, want to talk about this? Okay, so
can I just say one other thing, Helen?
Yeah.
If there's going to be any questions for the officers, I'd also like to bring up the fact that it hasn't been mentioned up to now that they talk about CAM compliance as being important for the distinction between two routes to the west, to the east of the West Cambridge side, and the fact that it needs to be segregated. Obviously, I think as Gabriel mentioned, only a very, very small section of that route will be segregated on either option. So how that can be a overriding factor, it's hard to be seen.
Okay, do Marcus and Rod, particularly, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, just maybe briefly, I'm very concerned about the environmental impact, because if I understood officers at the various Adams Road workshops correctly, the consultants had concluded that the rifle range route was so environmentally damaging that there was not going to be any way to mitigate the environmental impact. And Chris's presentation on the Binbrook flyover kind of confirms that given the flooding risk, given the sort of sensitive nature, and given, quite frankly, the impact on historically designated buildings by Clare Hall, I don't see how any of that consultants' report has been in any way addressed by these new board papers. It seems to just say that there's an overriding public interest, and we all know, unfortunately, that an environmental impact assessment doesn't necessarily consider alternative routes. So it will then just serve to justify the routes chosen here. But it would really interest me how a year ago we learned that the rifle range route was so environmentally damaging that it could no longer be considered. And now the world has turned upside down, and now it's kind of acceptable that nature will be destroyed and endangered species will be lost.
Rod?
I would just want to come back to the point in terms of journey times. I mean, look, I've been involved in this set of proposals for approximately 5 years, and one of the fundamental flaws of all the detailed analysis and evidence that's been put by the GCP in relation to this overall scheme is what happens when you get to Grange Road. And I think the first slide that was shown by Chris illustrates the fundamental flaw of this project, that actually what it actually delivers at the end of the day is not a superior journey experience for people who would take this form of public transport, but actually most probably an inferior one. And actually, given the fact that as you look, actually we're now just looking at inbound journeys, actually an on-road solution would actually accommodate in a much more efficient way, a lot cheaper, and also give us flexibility in terms of the CAM project and East-West Rail, rather than this very expensive scheme, which still only delivers us to Grange Road. So I do think that actually, if the GCP decide to approve the scheme and move forward, one of the fundamental questions a public inquiry will need to look at is that fundamental flaw that the GCP has failed to demonstrate to all stakeholders of the logic of delivering an off-road bus route to Grange Road.
Okay. Okay. And can you just, because we haven't talked about rifle range for a bit, can you just briefly summarise what the issues are? Why is it so sensitive?
So who was that directed to? That directed at me? Or?
Yeah.
Well, it's one of the key areas of Greenbelt looking onto Cambridge. It's part of the green corridor that comes into Cambridge. It's one of the areas where the Greenbelt gets closest to the centre of Cambridge. It's part of a continuous run of Greenbelt that comes all the way down through the Coton corridor, right up through the sort of Fellows Gardens of Kings and so on, right to the backs. Yeah, there's been many attempts by the colleges to develop that land. over time. There's a High Court judgment recently where they lost in an attempt to overturn the council's designation of it as Greenbelt, as an important element of Greenbelt. The council's own Greenbelt consultants have, on repeated occasions, identified how sensitive it is and how much difficulty there will be in trying to justify any development on that piece of Greenbelt. And I don't believe the council.
Could you just summarise then, as if people don't know, what the High Court judgment said, just very briefly?
Essentially, that was the, my understanding is that was the developers trying to overturn the council's designation of that as Greenbelt. So essentially the colleges who own the land there trying to get it developed for housing. And the colleges went to the High Court to try and force, so ironically it was actually at that point the council, I believe, defending this area and how important it was as Greenbelt. And the colleges failed in their attempt to have the designations overturned and to build on this area.
Okay, and when was that?
Oh, I don't know the exact date. Someone else might be able to tell. Someone else might be able to tell the exact date. It was.
That was 2008, and that was in relation to the 2006 local plan. More relevant, though, is actually the analysis undertaken for the 2018 local plan, the one that's currently operative, which, as Chris quite rightly identifies, this part of the Greenbelt around Cambridge was given the highest rating from the consultants as part of that local plan exercise. And indeed, the inquiry, the local plan inquiry, where both the colleges and the university was present arguing the case for developing Westfield, was quite interesting. I did attend it, and actually the inspector gave quite a lot of emphasis in relation to the environmental position of the Westfield, and in particular that analysis done by those consultants for the local plan.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, Chair, if I may, just to round that conversation off about the Greenbelt, and we've got a few comments on your presentation you've just given. I mean, in terms of the Greenbelt, the issue that both Rod refers to and also the previous High Court judgment was around inappropriate development in a Greenbelt. That doesn't apply to transport schemes as long as they go through the necessary tests, and that's the process that we're going through.
I think your consultants make clear that this one is inappropriate development.
No, that's not the case. I mean, we need to be clear on this because we need to be exact. That's not the case as it relates to transport schemes. We are obliged to go through the process, which is in part why we'll be going through the environmental impact assessment process to do that. Chair, if it helps, I do have a couple of comments, and I'm sure Joe does, on the presentations we've just seen, and the assertions that this is in some way inferior, or the journey time or journey time reliability doesn't offer a benefit, which is manifestly incorrect. And the information that is out there on the website that's available in the business case demonstrates that. And actually, just the people who travel that route in during the sort of the peak hours will bear testament to the levels of congestion on that. The assertion that was made earlier on around wider benefits that we are arbitrarily attaching to this, the benefits we're attaching to this relate to the local plan. I'm sure that Rod and others will recall the local plan process, and this high quality public transport corridor was considered specifically by the inspector, which is unusual. And a lot of the basis for the growth in this area, particularly around Bourne Airfield, was predicated on delivery of that. And so we're not just arbitrarily attaching benefits, the benefits that sit within the local plan environment, and so that does relate to the business case. In terms of the assessments that we've done, that again are all online. We've worked extensively with your technical group. I think we had 12 meetings. It might be a little bit more in terms of looking at northern alignment, on and off-road alignments, Madingley Hill, and all that information is available on the website that demonstrates we're not able to deliver that in the way that you wished. And so we've come forward with the preferred solution that we're obliged to demonstrate through Department of Transport guidance with the lower cost options, and that's what's in the business case. And that's
okay. Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, just to
no. On that particular point, I will come back to you, and I would say to you, particularly on the northern option, it was very difficult for us to consider that analysis was ever credible when a bus lane or a busway was not drawn into the plan, and no analysis was made to compare it with the preferred option. So I would stand by my introductory statement that was a whitewash of a piece of work.
So we'd agree to disagree, I think, but all that information is available on our website.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Does anybody want to come back on anything to do with that before we move on to Grenville?
Could I just make an observation of one of the technical committee on the LLF, that we did have an extensive set of meetings, as Peter has set out. We disagreed quite materially with officers in relation to quite extensive parts of the discussion that we had with officers. So I don't want any implication that the technical committee, we may have been presented data, but we did not necessarily agree with that data. And actually, in terms of other options, officers did explore other options, but it was on a very macro basis. And we did have to push quite materially, for example, for an option of the Girton interchange to be considered. But ultimately, a public inquiry, if this scheme does go forward, will be able to see all the evidence in terms of what the technical committee saw and what the technical committee disagreed with in relation to the officers' proposals.
But for example, with regards to Girton interchange, a lot of that discussion was around the assertion made by yourselves that Girton was going to be upgraded. And actually, Helen, it would have been useful at the start to mention that Highways England has published their new route improvement schemes, which does not allow for Girton interchange. We've talked about this quite extensively. GCP has supported the lobbying for that, but that does not feature within the Highways England plans. So the presumption that Girton is part of the future just simply isn't there in terms of investment plans for the future.
Yes, but our scheme was not predicated on it happening at the same time as a Girton interchange improvement. It was to be in place as a future proofing at some time when that happened. So it wasn't dependent on it coming at the same time as the Girton interchange. I think that was clear. Anyway, Gabriel, did you want to say something briefly before we move on?
Only just to comment on the point that was made about disagreement on journey times. It was actually agreed that there was no material difference in journey times between an on-road scheme with bus priority measures on Madingley Hill and the existing scheme, and that's actually reflected in the consultation documentation that is in the public domain from GCP. So it has been accepted that there is not a material transport journey time benefit by the off-road route through Hardwick and Coton, round the Westfields, and then down the Rifle Range onto Grange Road. And that's because after Grange Road you are stuck in city traffic, and that really ends up being the rate limiting step. That's all.
Okay. All right, I think we'll move on from all of that. And can I now bring in Grenville, because I know that you're itching to talk about Hardwick impacts.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Let me start by saying, whilst we would all like to see rapid, reliable and economically priced transport from Cambourne to Cambridge, it is totally unreasonable for that transport system to have a destructive impact upon the intermediate villages, as this scheme will. The system through Cambourne will, according to the previously published route, probably to be resurrected at some later date when the short-term temporary routes are ended, be off-road in places and in others will be segregated from other traffic. However, in some sections, it is ultimately proposed to travel extremely close to residential properties. And the threat to young children inadvertently running through their own garden gate and into the path of a fast-moving vehicle on a route which has previously been a cycle and pedestrian route, and due to size and weight, that vehicle will find it impossible to stop. And so the threat is clear and serious. After passing through the proposed Bourne airfield development, negotiating the dumbbell roundabouts at Hardwick as these vehicles enter and then exit the proposed park and ride site at Scotland Farm, this is going to cause significant delay both to passengers and residents who wish to enter or depart the village. But it is along St Neots Road that perhaps the most destructive element to the environment will occur, as the green barrier between St Neots Road and the parallel A428 is removed. Along the 1.8 mile stretch of tree and shrub barrier, there are estimated to be around 3,000 trees or shrubs, with some of those trees thought to be around 85 years old. That barrier not only provides the visual separation between the residential homes along St Neots Road and the fast-moving dual carriageway, it also provides some relief from both noise and pollution. But additionally, it is home to a wide variety of wildlife, and especially insects and birds, including the most beautiful yellowhammer, a protected species with a conservation status of red. And just Joe raised the question of interaction with traffic along St Neots Road. Let me just tell you that a vehicle travelling along a segregated trackway at an average speed of 50 miles an hour will take just 30 seconds less time to travel that distance compared with a regular on-road vehicle travelling at 40 miles an hour, the legal limit. So this is going to cost millions to save just 30 seconds. It is pointless and a total waste of taxpayers' money for such a minute saving in time. And should that line of trees be removed, the residents of St Neots Road will be left with no less than 8 lanes of traffic directly in front of their homes. And I know of no other rural location where such devastation has been caused and people's lives are damaged in such an appalling manner. And I have to tell you that a 3-metre combined cycle and pedestrian path is not a vast improvement on what we have. We all know that mixing cycles and pedestrians is fraught with difficulty and danger. But as these transit approach the delightful village of Coton, we once again find that these multi-passenger carrying vehicles are to be routed very, very close to residential homes, creating an unnecessary risk to both the residents and their property. And the track upon which they're required to travel to get there will destroy the wonderful landscapes as they cross the fields leading down from the Madingley roundabout, and they will be visible from miles away. All these points, of course, have previously been made at other local liaison forum meetings, both in June 19 and January 2020. And whatever is said, I still believe that the majority of the points that we have made have not been addressed. But finally, let me remind you of some of the comments that were made by people who at the time would have considered themselves senior local politicians shortly after the May 2018 District Council elections, just 2 short years ago. Councillor van der Weyer said, "I cannot support the off-road option at all. The finances and cost benefits are still not clear. There are fundamental problems. It would do huge damage to the villages along the route. The time saving from that route would not justify that level of destruction." And Councillor Bridget Smith said, "The idea of having buses zooming past people's homes had upset many residents who expressed concern about the impact they may have on small villages. Opposition to the off-road busway had been a factor in the Lib Dems' victory in South Cambridgeshire." Let's hope the electors remember that. I have to say I agree with them both. I think their points were well made at the time, and they're as relevant today as they were then. This plan is fundamentally flawed, and time should be taken to reconsider the entire plan in the light of the Cam Metro and East West Rail. So I implore the board to take the brave step and pause these proposals whilst a detailed study of the combination of the transport routes takes place. Thank you.
Thank you, Grenville. Does anybody want to comment on any of that? No. Okay. Can we then move on to a discussion of East West Rail? And I think Marcus is planning to lead that. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's late in the day, so I will make it really quick. When the decision was made that the corridor, the preferred corridor for East West Rail, is also the option E that the South Cambridgeshire District Council and the Cambridge City Council preferred, I thought that the C2C off-road busway was dead in the water, because I was under the impression that here East West Rail is going to deliver a high quality transport scheme that is very reliable, where one train replaces 12 buses and gets to the employment centers, especially the ever-expanding biomedical campus. As you can see from the slide, there's going to be definitely a station planned for Cambourne. And let's not forget, people from Cambourne don't just travel to Cambridge City, they also travel to St. Neots and to access the St. Neots train line. So for them, this will be a massive improvement of their living and transport situation. So then to find in the board papers 4 paragraphs that were basically done on the back of a fact pack is inappropriate in the extreme. It fundamentally changes the business case for this transport scheme, and that is not represented in the current board papers. I appreciate that there are uncertainties as to where exactly the route will go, but given that we have the corridor alignment, we can use that alignment to make calculations as to journey times, as to travel times, as to travel destinations. If we go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight that it is a myth what we were told in January, that East West Rail was kind of a pie in the sky, not really realistic at this point, and something that is aspirational at best, maybe utopian at worst. And in a way, the outreach material that East West Rail put out puts a stop to that discussion, because if you look at the right-hand corner, construction should start in 2025. So this is not a kind of aspirational scheme. If the timeline is kept, and we know that the South Cambridge station is already taking into account that there will be an additional rail route coming in from the south. Given that that is the case, I think it is now time to revisit the business case and revisit the objectives that we have with this off-road scheme, which, by the way, remains the most expensive option that the C2C has considered. And we've pointed this out. I've asked my very first question on this over 5 years ago now, in May 2015, and I'm still waiting for answers. Thank you very much, Helen.
Okay. Thank you, Marcus. Anybody want to comment, or should we press on? Peter.
Oh, just a quick comment, Chair, if I may. I mean, it's probably notable that East West Rail, one of the reasons they gave for choosing the Cambourne corridor was the ability to complement the Cambourne to Cambridge in the CAM scheme.
True. Steve, do you want to comment on that? Steve Jones?
Just say, yeah, but if that degree of complementation is there, or complementarity is there, then you'd also be sharing the wider economic benefits and the property value uplift between the two schemes, which would give you a cost benefit ratio of under 1 for C2C. I think that's why it's so important that they're planned in an integrated way, and also with emerging plans for CAM.
So I'm happy to go into the econometrics and the fact that East West Rail looks at the wider growth beyond the current local plan, but Cambourne and Cambridge looks at the existing local plan, and that's what we're dealing with. But again, all I'd say is all of that's on the website, and we've discussed it previously.
I'd be happy. I would be happy to go through this with you too, because I think what you've just said is disingenuous, but we could do that.
Just Steve, just to be absolutely clear, the benefits in terms of land value uplift for C2C are from developments that are not served by East West Rail. Quite simply, they are served by C2C. They are not served by East West Rail. We can take it offline, but it's very misleading to suggest that this is disingenuous.
But the wider economic benefits are potentially both. Yeah, and where we had the failure to take account of the comparators that we gave you, the alternative schemes, we should really be looking at your preferred scheme versus the best of those alternatives. Cost benefit analysis is meant to look at the preferred scheme relative to the best alternative use of public money. That's what you don't do in this analysis.
Well, we have done extensively.
Yeah, but you don't do here. You present it now as the scheme versus do nothing. That's not the correct way to look at it. Is to look at it in terms of your scheme versus the best alternative, which is one of the things that we proposed to you in the technical group repeatedly, and you've ignored.
No, we have undertaken a series of option appraisal reports which look at, for phase 1, the scheme versus alternatives, and a range of online and offline alternatives. We've then, as you know, then looked at alternatives for phase 2 as well. So there's been a whole series of option appraisals that have been gone through.
Okay.
Sorry, I think it would be better if we did this offline.
Had his hand up as a virtual raised hand for a while. I don't know if that's part of this though.
What's
Sorry,
that?
it's actually just been. I just forgot to put it down. Sorry. I wonder why my arm was hurting so much. I don't know. I'll just try and do it.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments on that?
Well, just to also highlight that the mayor has put out a statement saying he doesn't think this is compliant with the sub-strategy and this is compliant with his plans for the CAM. I wonder whether officers could maybe react to that.
I mean, you'll understand it's a little above my pay grade to comment on a mayor or what a politician has said. What I will say, though, is that the proposal's absolutely compliant with the local transport plan. And we as the scheme developer are obliged to demonstrate compliance, which is why we've reviewed the sub-strategy as well. And that is also a matter for consideration by the Joint Assembly and the Executive Board. But we are confident that we comply with the statutory policy basis as it relates to this area.
Peter, can I just ask, why didn't you wait for the final version and you did the analysis with the draft version, which is up for consultation?
We agreed that we would pause the decision, which I think people we've discussed earlier on, from the February board to consider this. So we've had opportunity following the published consultation that's gone out to consider that, and we believe we're now in a position to take this forward.
But it is a draft, no?
it's not a final sub strategy, but I'm sure, as colleagues of the combined authority would say, that they are obliged to keep the local transport plan under ongoing review, and I would expect them to do that. And during the life of any large project, the delivery of which happens over a number of years, there are a series of changes to the local policy context, which is why in my very first slide I made clear that we continue to review this and all of our schemes against both transport policy, the emerging local plan, and indeed any policy that comes out of Whitehall.
Anybody else?
Ellen, I've got a question from the climate change organiser here in Hardwick, and he asked the following question. It is commendable that reducing air pollution is a major aim of the scheme. Please explain how removing most of the trees along St Neots Road in Hardwick is consistent with this aim when this 2018 report by DEFRA predicts this will have the effect of doubling the amount of air pollution for Hardwick, particularly affecting residents of St Neots Road and the children attending Hardwick Primary School, which is less than 300 metres from the trees, the protection of air pollution from the A428. Please explain also how you plan to replace the stored carbon value of this wildlife corridor, which is storing the equivalent of at least 500 tonnes of CO2. In particular, how will this plan benefit the residents of Hardwick?
So just to be clear in terms of the impact, there's been a lot of talk about, for example, 1.8 metres and 3,000 trees. We're not proposing to remove all the trees between the A428 and the St Neots Road. There are undeniably, at the narrowest points, we have very little choice, unfortunately, but to take trees out. And there's probably about a mile, which is the narrowest point where you've got least space to play with. We will be taking out a significant number of trees, probably much less than the LLF technical group's preferred online scheme, which would take a huge number of mature trees along the Madingley Road. Either way, there is also a very clear commitment on behalf of GCP to biodiversity net gain. And so in terms of future sequestration of carbon, that we will be looking to plant new trees and create other biodiverse spaces to provide an overall benefit in terms of biodiversity. So we don't take trees out lightly, and we understand the concern that has been raised eloquently by the local community. But in terms of the carbon impacts, we would be looking at that and ensuring that we will be more than replacing like for like.
I was actually driving along the dual carriageway just the other day, and I was really surprised to discover that the actual dual carriageway was raised, significantly above ground level. And so, I think we do need some realistic elevations done of what exactly those houses on St Neots Road will see, with the 8 lanes of traffic, the 4. Some and many of the houses with with 4 of those lanes raised, with lorries on going, a significant number of miles an hour. And I think, just the visual impact of that, it really struck me. Needs to be better understood. This isn't just about trees. This is,
No, absolutely. The visual impact is important, and that is definitely part of the environmental impact assessment process, is to provide those visualizations.
Okay, I now want to move on to Tom, please. You're going to talk about CAM compliance here, I think.
Yes.
Thank you. Tom Bygert, we need the presentation.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the technical issues that could come about when the CAM Metro takes over this busway. And I think it's worth pointing out that a detailed technical specification for the CAM Metro and its vehicles hasn't yet been published. And it's been stated a number of times today that what's planned is compatible with the LTP on the strategy, but I think there's a very big difference between being compatible with a high-level strategy and being compatible with a technical specification. So I guess my main point today is really to say that if the GCP wants to make a decision on this route before all of the technical information is available about what the Cam Metro will be and what sort of vehicles it will run, then it really needs to err on the side of caution when imagining what the capabilities of the Cam will be. So if you'd have one more click. So on this route, there are two very, very sharp 90-degree angles. I walked through the route the other day, and I can imagine a bus turning around these corners. But since we don't know what kind of vehicle the Cam will use, we shouldn't really automatically assume that it will be able to turn around the same tight corners. And one example of that is that if there are these very tight corners, that really limits the vehicles to only having one carriage, because once you have two or more carriages in the vehicle, for example, as with a tram or with a bendy bus kind of solution, you're really limiting the design of that vehicle by making the corners so tight. So next slide. So one of the issues that I want to flag up, and I'm not sure to what extent the officers have actually looked into this question, is the issue of a tunnel portal. So obviously, if the Cam is going to go underground under Cambridge, it needs to come out of the ground at some point. And we don't really know how long that portal needs to be, because there's actually a lot of engineering work that needs to go into that calculation. So one part of it is what the maximum gradient of the Cam system will be. And also engineering work needs to be done on things like taking soil samples to find out how deep tunnels need to be before it passes under some kind of obstacle at the surface. And if with the rifle range route, we actually build across the middle of the largest space that's on the ground there now, that may actually limit the ability to design a tunnel portal there. So one of the other issues also is that there needs to be somewhere to assemble tunnel boring machines, and TBMs can be about 150 meters long. So I'm not an engineer myself, but I'm just flagging this up as an area that really needs to be looked in detail before we actually plan a route through here. Next slide. So one of the issues that may happen is that if space isn't reserved for a tunnel portal, it may be necessary at a later stage to design one at a slightly different location. And as this map shows, that could be a very suboptimal solution. And of course, that might also require more land take into the West Fields, which is something that we're trying to preserve. Next slide. So this is, I made this map, and I do recognize I made a little bit of a mistake with the Upper Cambourne section, and I see that you've got a diversion through Lancaster Gate. But I think the key point to note here is just trying to visualize where East-West Rail is likely to want to build the station, and the fact that it would be very difficult to extend this route on anything other than road surface. So if you have the next slide, to either of the possible locations that you could really see. And I know that there has been talk that the south of Cambridge is the preferred location, but I think it would be a mistake to sort of preempt East-West Rail in making the decision, because there may be a number of other factors that come into play later on that actually lead them to choose a northern location for it. Now I'm going to skip over the next two slides, but essentially the point I want to make here is that we need to really recognize that this Cambourne section is not really going to be suitable for the metro, and that if we do build this section, it will be necessary to duplicate things by building a metro route elsewhere. And this, I noticed that there's 8 houses that face onto what I've got on this map, but it's been necessary to actually divert south of that. So I'll sort of skip that as an issue. So if we now go to the next slide. So this is a view of the central section past Hardwick. Now, I'd like to mention that as District Councillor for Dry Drayton, the notion of building a park and ride at Scotland Farm is extremely unpopular. And one of the main sort of concerns that people have is that large numbers of people will want to drive through Dry Drayton in order to reach that location. So I think if we tried to look at a solution where we have a number of smaller stations on the route, that would sort that out. And then the last point I want to make touches on what Grenville has been saying, and that is the enormous environmental damage of cutting down what could be up to 3,000 trees. And that because there are a lot fewer obstacles on the north side of the A428, it may actually be that the most suitable metro route is actually north of the A428. And depending on what East West Rail wants to do with their station location, it would be a tragedy to cut down all of these trees until we're actually certain that we really want to stay south of the A428. So my last point on that really is that there's no reason that the entire route has to be built or has to be decided on in one go. And I really feel that it's premature to be making a decision on this part of the route until we know what East West Rail wants to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we comment on that, can Des, have you got a couple of comments to make? Where's Des gone?
Yes, please, if I may. And really, it's just this is a plea really to the officers, who I think have been put in a fairly invidious position. I think the landscape has changed dramatically because of the East-West Rail. And I think the imperative for development on Bourne Airfield and West Cambourne is now driving everything on that timetable. And that's a big mistake. So at the moment, I feel very strongly that we've got a situation now that has been driven by the local plan and the imperative to build on Bourne Airfield and West Cambourne within a specific time frame. And we run the risk of delivering a busway that will be superseded by the East-West Rail, and we're going to miss a tremendous opportunity to give a proper A428 rounded solution for public transport by not stalling everything for the moment, understanding that development will happen on the A428. It's just a question of when it happens, integrating it with the East-West Rail, and then building a complementary bus system that allows us to bring people to the rail station and to other parts of Cambridge that are not served by the East-West Rail. I think this is an enormous mistake we're about to make, and we're about to spend an enormous amount of money. It needs some further thought. And I feel really sorry for the officers. I think you're being asked to deliver something that I know in 10 or 15 years time will look like an enormous mistake. So my message to the board is that you must stop being completely and utterly blinkered on delivering to the local plan on the timescale we've currently got. It's a big mistake.
Anybody else want to come in on that? Ruth.
Yes, hello, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to make it clear that Cambourne Town Council doesn't want any more delay, as our current transport provision is extremely poor. We've always said that we wanted fast, reliable and affordable, and we didn't really mind where that route went as long as it ticked those 3 boxes. Having said that, it should not be at the expense of our neighbouring parishes. Also, Cambourne will benefit from a joined up transport strategy that acknowledges East-West Rail, a Cam Metro, as well as the bus routes. So I'm very reassured to hear that the GCP is going to review the routes when the East-West Rail plans are published. And believe me, if Cambourne has anything to do with it, the station will be to the north of Cambourne on the A428. But I do remain concerned about the compatibility with the Cam Metro, especially listening to the details that Tom has just explained, the 90-degree angles, the tunnels possibly being elsewhere. So I'd very much like the GCP to keep the dialogue open with the combined authority so that the bus route and the Cam Metro can both use the best route before spending a lot of public money. Thank you.
Shrabona, do you want to say anything on this? Can't hear her, can you?
Yeah, I'm just getting in. So I'm starting my video. Anyway, I have just written here, I have written on the chat box for the panel that why do not we have a revised regular bus system, which actually covers most of the key destination and the routes, which are also cheaper and never been discussed. We do have the stagecoach buses are already running. So I think the existing buses, we do have the realistic capacity of solving the current problems if only we do revise the routes and their prices. It can also be planned efficiently to solve everyone's problem, because it is a long going discussion and wordings and meetings and wordings, and we are not reaching anywhere. Meanwhile, we can actually use this bus system, which will be quicker and cheaper as well. I believe the existing stagecoach can also be transformed to be a robust solution. If we, I have seen there's a similar bus system in the Lothian system, and also regarding the proposed busway, which I thought it can be a solution, but it is not going to reach everywhere, like the St. Neots railway station, the Royston railway station, the Cambridge city centre. It is not reaching the many destination or the key destinations. So that's why I realized the people will still use their cars unless they do have the good connections for their work. And if we do not offer the people the right service with the better connection, and especially for at the office hours, and it is not going to reduce the cars on the roads. And people in Cambourne look forward to seeing a faster and cheaper solution as soon as possible. Thank you.
So are you saying, Shrabona, that you like the mayor's idea of fast and efficient buses now to?
Yes, well, because any system you are now discussing or talking, it may come in the future. That is fine and well and good. Let them come and let the discussions keep going years, and now I do not know the months and years. But we really need something faster and quicker, because this is the time where people are going to their work, and Cambourne is a village. The 90% people are the professional people. They go to their work to the Cambridge, Peterborough, they go to the London. The students also, they go to to study to the different places, and we do need a quicker solution. And this discussion, the busway or train or helicopter someday will come on the table, and we will keep discussing on that something is coming and coming. I'm telling you, the people in Cambourne, they really need something faster and quicker. And then from that point of view, I see the bus. I have seen the Mid-Lothian bus, the Lothian bus in Edinburgh, and the around places, they really run efficiently. They run fantastic, the Lothian buses. We do have the stagecoach bus system, which is an existing system, but no one actually talks on the existing system. The people are busy on talking and chatting and discussion on the non-existent system too much. But I do not see any solution is coming very soon. And when we are going to the work every day, when the people are going to the work every day and no solution in coming in the weeks or in months, in the years, why do not we use the system what we do have already in the place? It is just we need to make a robust, just to make a right routes for the people. Then they can use those routes to go to their work and job and the railway stations, and that's all.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, folks, unless anyone has any particular additional comments to make, shall we just decide what we're going to recommend?
Lynn, sorry, can I just a final comment? Joe, you thank you for your presentations, and Peter. But you mentioned that no investment in the area of Cambourne might not be required in the future. So it's kind of flexible, but there is no. I don't understand why it is justified to do it just in the section of Cambourne, not to do a big investment, but it is not in other sections of the scheme. So I don't know why there is that flexibility only in one section of the scheme, bearing in mind that you're thinking that might be compliant with the other schemes. I don't know if that was clear.
Well, actually getting into Cambourne, I think there's one thing, and this isn't meant to underplay the impact of removing trees, which no one wants to do, but is far less traumatic than removal of houses, which would probably be the alternative. Cambourne's quite heavily developed, as you know. So in terms of the actual route into Cambourne, there isn't an awful lot of space to play with. There is an alternative, to be fair, which we've talked about with the CAM team in the past, which before East West Rail and the idea of a southern station came on, would be the idea that potentially CAM vehicles would go up the Broadway and the St Neots Road. So not a million miles to what the sort of thing Tom was talking about, which could be a route that would access a station to the north of Cambourne. Although I would stress that East West Rail are very clear in their preferred corridor that they intend the station to be south of Cambourne, and that's not a GCP decision, that's an East West Rail decision. So in terms of actually getting into Cambourne, and the scheme is the Cambourne to Cambridge scheme, the end of the scheme, both at Cambourne and Cambridge, inevitably needs to get into those open areas, and at that point it needs to go on street, because both with Cambourne and Cambridge, there's no easy way in. Cambourne, the only way to get in would be to go along the St Neots Road and down in from the north, and that is possibly what might be needed to ensure CAM compatibility in the future. In the shorter term, with the proposed C2C vehicles, we would be able to go in as proposed through the east. So automated vehicles, as was rightly pointed out, wouldn't be able to go in on the route we're looking at. If were they to be deployed in the future, subject to future regulations, etc., they'd be more likely to come in from the north.
Thank you. Yeah, so just coming in on the question of the East-West Rail route. So I do know that they are very much more keen on a southern Cambourne station site. But I think that until the costs of the various alternative routes that they're looking at have been published, and until an alignment has gone through consultation, there may be a whole range of other issues that come forward. So in order to have a southern station location, there's a possibility of the route going past more South Cambridgeshire villages, and there may be quite a deal of opposition. So we saw earlier a slide from East West Rail that actually had the name Toft right in the middle of the path. And I'm sure the residents of Toft are not all that keen for the railway to go rather on top of or right next to their village. So there may be quite a lot of public opposition to going along that route. And it may also turn out that because of the number of villages that are down there, that the cost may be higher. So I just feel that even though there is a desire and a willingness to go a southern route, and particularly I think they're very keen to go into the South Cambridge station, we really don't know what's practical and what's possible until a lot of that work on the alignments has been done.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Tom. I feel we should be wrapping this up now. So can we think about what we want to recommend? I've quickly written, as we've been speaking in the last 5 minutes, an idea that maybe summarise what it is we've said, but I'm happy to be contradicted on that. So if I press share screen, do I then click on what I've written? I imagine. Okay, let me try that. Does anybody see anything?
If you share screen, it should show you whatever you've got on your computer, whatever you're looking at.
Okay, so I've shared screen. Can you see it?
No.
Oh. Okay, let me try again.
Hi, Helen. If you click on the share screen button, it should give you some options around what you've got on your screen, what applications you've got open, and what part you might want to share.
Okay, that one. Now, can you see that?
Yeah. Yes.
Or do we want to say something different, or do we want to say the same as we said last time? And I can read out that resolution.
Could I suggest replacing the word major with mayor?
Where's that? The major. I mean, there seems to have been a few themes here. One of them is that there's a lot of questions unanswered that we feel, even though we've worked, consistently with GCP over the last 3 years, there seemed to be a consistent theme there. There's obviously the East-West Rail and now the CAM potential incompatibility.
Helen, given that there was so much public celebration of the switch from Adams Road to the rifle range, might it not be useful to also highlight that we express concern about the environmental impact cutting through the West Fields?
Okay.
Helen, could I just make a point just to clarify as well? Is that there is one of the arguments for the C2C scheme has been about providing a cycle route alongside to serve the villages as well. But there is an alternative. There is an alternative cycle route which follows the Cambourne Greenway, which goes via Hardwick and the Bridleway. And I understand that was actually we've certainly proposed that, and others have, which would actually be a better cycle route anyway, because it doesn't involve cycling up the hill and it's more away from traffic. So I think we just need to make clear that if we are proposing an interim solution, we're not proposing that any cycle improvement will be paused, but rather that could be delivered by the Cambourne Greenway scheme instead.
Thank you, James. Agreed entirely.
Okay. Do we want to reiterate our issues with, around Hardwick and Madingley Hill, or do we assume that we've said that before? And what do we want to do? Do we want to make it a simple resolution, or do we want to?
I think we've said it before. The key really for me is to get a pause until a proper review is undertaken of a combined transport strategy for the whole area. This is just nonsense going ahead with this on its own, and ignoring everything else. I think you've got it.
Yes, I
agree with Grenville. Sorry, can I say I agree with Grenville on that point? Because our resolution could restate a lot of the things we've already said, and then things could rather get lost. I think focusing on the fact we need a pause until transport can be properly assessed. I mean, various of us mentioned what the new normal might be in terms of COVID, and wanting to know if there's change in working patterns, peak time, flexible hours, working from home, and so on. There are all kinds of up in the air now transport implications for this route that will affect the business case, and so a pause is needed to see each of these things.
Can I also suggest on the first line to maybe change the opposes? Because we're not opposing, we would like to see a scheme happening. It's not opposing for the sake of it, but we would like to see that kind of bringing together all the strategies. So the LLF, would kind of support the development of this, but we need to kind of make sure that everything is kind of aligned and in place and coordinated, and we have this big picture transport strategic that we need. So I don't know how you word that, but
could we say opposes the continuation of the development of the current proposed scheme, current proposed C2C scheme? That might be a better way of saying it, because I agree with Lena that we're not opposing improving transport. Just the current scheme is what the continuation of the current scheme is what we're opposing.
Yes, agreed.
Could I suggest replacing the word continuation with premature, or continuation of with premature?
Continuation of premature development.
Yeah, because I think that the issue is that while there are so many issues that are not resolved and other interactions that we need to really think about more, it's premature to make a decision right now. So premature actually replaces the word continuation of. Or a premature decision, maybe.
Yeah, a premature decision.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do we like the second line?
Yep.
Yep.
I would still say environmentally damaging, given the trees and Hardwick and the Westfield.
And environmentally damaging.
Yes, clearly, yeah. Good point, Marcus. Thank you. Wow.
And I'd also suggest replacing not fit with unfit, because it implies you could read that it's not fit for purpose, it was not anachronistic, which is obviously a
bit of wordsmithing.
And is now out of step with oops, increasingly out of step. Or
I would say also maybe highlight that the East-West Rail, it is kind of a material change. It's not like another bus coming. I think it's a quite big £1 billion scheme.
It's a game changer.
It shouldn't be underestimated. Yeah.
So do we want that here? This is a multi-billion-pound scheme that needs to be, firmly understood first.
Yeah, definitely.
For clarity as well, Helen, on that second point, it should say the new EWR station, rather than, it's not a CAM station. It's an East-West Rail station.
Yeah, I agree.
Sorry, say that again. I was typing.
The second point is the location of a new station. It should be a new East-West Rail station, or EWR station, so that we make it distinctive from a CAM station, or just to be clear.
Okay.
And
I think this is a point that that Shrabona was making about,
and I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Doing something now to the key. Do we need to put in key employment destinations? So.
Yeah. Well, I think it's that residents, they want to see something happening now. And this is, officers are already assuming that this is going to go through public inquiry, not trying to avoid it. So I think it is, if we can encourage for the GCP to try and do something now, instead of waiting 6-7 years for anything to happen, then yeah.
Yeah, well, James Palmer said that he had the money to go to put on the bus routes straight away for Cambourne to the Science Park, Cambourne to Addenbrooke's. So something along those lines to make sure that they stay in place as well. I mean, it's, I think nothing to do with GCP, but those are the bus routes that we need.
And could we, rather than say bus lanes, could we say bus priority measures, because it can be broader than that?
Mm.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's why I was that is why I was mentioning particularly the stagecoach. I was using the word stagecoach so that it should not be mixed up with the bus lane. I mean the busway and the existing bus routes. Routes are, I mean, the buses are already there. Roads are already there. You don't have to spend any extra money on that. It is just a little bit of planning. That's it. Even if you do not go for a longer planning, only the buses in the morning hours, evening hours, that will also solve the problem currently.
So could we say exactly where your pointer is now, interim bus priority measures and or improved services?
Yeah. I think that's a good proposal.
That sounds good.
Okay.
So just two minor points. In the very first line, do we want to say the premature decision or a premature decision based on whether the decision's actually happened yet or not? And also whether we should call it a Cambourne to Cambridge busway proposal.
Or scheme. I think they call it a scheme, don't they?
Scheme.
So. Okay.
I just hope it means that people will listen, but I worry.
Yes, we all hope that. We all do.
Yes. Well, I was very pleased to see that there was at least one board member here listening as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Two, I think.
Yeah.
Just in that last point, I know that there was quite a lot of work done on quick wins by the LLF and the officers, and I'm just wondering whether that last point might encourage a review or a revisit of some of the quick wins in order to get bus priority measures in place quickly to deliver some improvement in the short term. I'm not sure how far they went and how quickly they were dismissed, but I know there was quite a lot of work done on that.
It was quite a lot of work done by the technical group. I think it was a few minutes by the. I think a lot more could be done. It was brushed away very, very quickly.
But in light of the circumstances we now faced with East West Rail coming, and all the points have been made about what the new normal may be, whether or not even the build out rate for West Cambourne and Bourne Airfield is in any way sustainable. We could be looking at a much slower development growth and a slower demand for. So I think that is a very valid point about if we're going to propose doing nothing for the moment and on the busway, then we should be looking to put something in place to alleviate Cambourne residents.
I think that's what we support, the development of interim bus priority measures and or improved services. I think that's what that means. Well, that's how I interpret.
Can I also add on that very much to back up Des's point, and also to pick up what Grenville said earlier about previous statements by South Cambs members as well. The local plan is important, and it was mentioned, I think, by Peter Blake earlier that the inspector has commented on the high quality public transport scheme as being relevant when looking at the local plan and the viability of the local plan and the 5-year housing land supply. It is important to note, and one of the things that politicians I'm sure will be looking at on the board, that if the current building out rate is considered to be different by the inspector based on decisions here or COVID or construction rate and so on, that any knock-on effect on the 5-year housing land supply could bring that into question. We hope that isn't the case. If that is in question, then certainly there is a threat of speculative development to villages all over the district. And that's not something I'm sure we'd like to see, which is why it is vital that this isn't purely opposition, that there are measures put into place not only for urgently needed for the residents of Cambourne, but also to make sure that the proposed schemes in the local plan are possible based on there being a proper and in place now, not delayed for years for public inquiries, a proper interim bus measures, sort of public transport measures that work, that would support all of these things.
Well, that's one of the reasons why for the last 4 years, the LLF has been proposing an on-road solution that will deal with this. Yep. So this is nothing new.
Yeah. So could we add in high quality between interim and bus? So interim high quality bus priority measures, and could we say then to Phil's point, could we say that can support the local plan and provide immediate transport benefits in the next line?
Can I just add that if I recall, on the last local plan, the 2018, actually the county council transport strategy, which was kind of had a mini refresh as part of that, was proposing an on-road route down Madley Rise.
Correct. Yeah.
So I mean, we're not being outrageous in terms of what the LLF solution was, yeah. and I would echo the comments that in relation that the technical group spent a lot of time on this, and we didn't really get a lot of traction with the officers.
And the local plan itself, as amended and agreed by the inspector, specifies an on-road or off-road high quality system. It doesn't require it to be off-road.
Right.
No.
Okay, so you want the bit about the local plan in there?
I think it's probably not a bad idea because it shows that it is. I think Philip's point is a very valid one. Yes. So that can support the local plan and provide immediate transport benefits. Thank you.
Well done.
All right.
Yeah. Very good, Helen.
Everybody happy with that?
Really good job, Helen.
Very
well
happy.
done.
Yeah. Yes.
Well done, Helen.
I'm going to stop my share. There we are. So thank you, everybody, for taking part.
Do we need to vote?
We do need to vote on that, yeah.
And I was going to say, when we do that, Helen,
do we now know?
We can obviously, well, we have the list of all of those attendees who put their hand up earlier, but obviously we can't get them to put their hand, we can't get them to say, because they can't chat or whatever. So I think when we ask the question, we have to be very clear that if they raise their hand, at that point, they're raising their hand to agree or to disagree.
Can I just suggest that we do it in the reverse, that if people are in agreement, they don't raise their hand. If they're opposing it, they raise their hand. Hopefully it'll be much fewer numbers, so we'll be able to cope with them. That's how we've been doing it in terms of democratic processes in other settings, local authority settings, and I think it's much easier for all the participants. So you need to just be clear that ask people to raise their hand if they're opposing the resolution. And implicitly, therefore, people who are supporting it are not raising their hand.
Yes.
What about abstentions?
Yeah, and abstentions as well.
So we don't know how many people are still here, though, do we? So we're just going to.
There are 40 attendees still. As to how many of those are the ones that I noted earlier, I hope they're still here if they want to vote.
Okay. Let me share my screen again so people know what they're voting on. Okay, so if anybody disagrees with this resolution, would they please raise their hand?
That's fine.
Anybody raising their hand? I can only see my screen.
No, nobody's raising the hand.
Okay. Okay.
Looking on the attendees list, there's no hand been raised on there that I can see.
Okay. If anybody wants to abstain from this resolution, could they please raise their hand?
David Jones abstaining.
Okay. And we're not going to ask who supports it then?
Everyone else.
Everyone
else, yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Helen, can I just confirm that we do have the numbers of the correct numbers of people who are on the LLF who are actually participating, because that will be quite important as we're working back to work out the number of people who are supporting.
Phil, did you do that?
I noted them before, although I suppose actually, since we've got everything else out of the way and we're absolutely clear now who was opposed, no one, and abstained, one, could the attendees who had previously put their hand up to say they were members of the LLF raise their hand? They come to the top of the.
Does that not include us then?
So not us, because we can see us on the screen, but I can see hands going up from those who therefore agreed. Although David Jones has put his hand up, or has his hand still up, but I've noted he's abstained. So I can see then Josh Newman, Rita Langham, Cheney and Payne, Jenny Julian, Josh Matthews, Jean Glasberg, Ellen Kamenitsky. It's going further down. Okay, they've all raised their hands, so I haven't seen anything from Daniel Strauss or Joseph O'Dwyer or Charles Doyley.
Okay, so if there's 7 participants who have raised their hand, there were 13 of us minus that's I've minus myself, so 13 voting members plus, oh, and 8 now. So 13 plus 8, 21. So 21 for and 1 abstain. Yeah.
None against.
Any against? There were none against, were there?
No.
No.
Okay. Okay. Happy with that, everybody?
Yep.
You've done a great job, Helen. Well done.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And then are you going to present it to the board and the assembly, or just the board?
Well, what do we think? I mean, I
think it would be useful for both.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, so you want me to present to both? Okay, I'll do that then.
Well done.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Peter and Joe.
Yeah, well
Thank
done,
you.
guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And Alistair and Beth.
Yeah, Alistair and Beth.
And
Thank you for
James.
giving up your evenings.
Night, everybody.
My dinner's
Night.
going in the
Thank you.
dog.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Good night. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.